January 15th, 1941. Warsaw, Poland. The winter was cruel that year. The streets, already tight and crowded with the growing weight of poverty, had taken on the sharp bite of the cold. Warsaw was under the heel of Nazi occupation. Fear had settled in like an eternal fog, thickening the air with the bitter promise of nothing but hardship. People kept their heads down, eyes averted. The small shops, once bustling with activity, stood shuttered, their windows covered in dust. In one of the cramped alleys, tucked between two buildings in the Jewish quarter, a boy watched. His name was Aaron. Barely 14, he was a shadow in the crowd. The sounds of the city didn't reach him the same way they reached others. Instead, he heard the soft rustle of wind through the gutters, the quick footsteps of soldiers moving briskly, always in groups, always on alert. And more importantly, he saw things that other people missed. Aaron's life had always been different. He was the son of a poor tailor, a man who made less than a fraction of what the Germans and their collaborators demanded for work. But even in a city ruled by fear and despair, Aaron had developed a sharpness in his mind that few could match. He spent his days walking the streets of Warsaw, his eyes scanning the city like a hawk. Every soldier's movement, every German officer's face, every sound in the streets was a piece of the puzzle he was putting together. The occupation was methodical, cruel in its efficiency, but also careless in its arrogance. The soldiers didn't know they were being watched. No one saw the boy standing in the alleyway, holding his breath, his hands clenched in the pockets of a threadbare coat. They didn't see how he pieced together the Germans' routines, their secret meetings, their patrol routes. Aaron had never been given the luxury of education. His schooling had ended the day the occupation began. But he had a gift. He understood patterns, human behavior, routines, the ways people moved through the world. It wasn't something he had learned. It was something that had always been inside him, something that made him see what others couldn't. And in the midst of war, in the chaos of the occupation, it was a power that might just be his salvation. He was young. He was poor. He was nothing. The world had written him off long before the Nazis came. But in his mind, in the swirling chaos of Warsaw, there was an opportunity, something the enemy had overlooked. One night, when the air was particularly thick with the scent of smoke, Aaron found himself watching a German officer, a tall man with sharp features, as he walked past the alley. His steps were quick, but Aaron noticed something. A small slip of paper had fallen from the officer's jacket pocket, fluttering to the ground. No one noticed it but Aaron. He hesitated for a moment before moving, his feet light against the frozen pavement. The officer had long gone, but the paper remained. Aaron picked it up and unfolded it. It wasn't just a note. It was a code, something written in a language that only certain people could understand. It was the first piece of the puzzle, a small clue in a world that seemed bent on crushing him. Aaron knew this was important. He couldn't explain why, but the code spoke to him. It was a way into something much larger, something he had been sensing in the quiet moments when the city's noise died down. The Germans were more disorganized than they appeared. They relied on systems that were vulnerable, and Aaron's sharpness had just given him the first foothold to unravel it. For days, he studied the note, unable to make sense of most of it. But then, one evening, something clicked. The letters began to form words, and the words began to form meaning. It was a list, names, dates, and places. What caught his attention was not the names, but the pattern. This was something more than just a random string of information. This was military intelligence, but it wasn't written in a way that most people could decode. It was an encrypted message, and Aaron had a mind sharp enough to recognize it. He had seen codes like this in old books his father kept in a shop. He had no formal training in cryptography, but he understood it instinctively. As the days passed, Aaron worked in secret. He had to be careful. The walls of Warsaw were full of eyes, and the punishment for being caught was death. But Aaron didn't fear the Nazis in the way others did. His fear was of something else, the fear of never being seen, never being noticed. But in this moment, with the code in his hands, he realized something. He was seen now, and his mind, his intellect, was something the Germans could not ignore. His discovery didn't come without its challenges. The more he decrypted the code, the more dangerous the situation became. The officers were growing suspicious. Patrols became more frequent. People on the street began whispering about raids. But Aaron didn't stop. He couldn't. His fingers moved faster, piecing together fragments of information, unraveling the Nazi network one detail at a time. By the end of January, he had cracked most of the code. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps, certain pieces of information he couldn't access, but it was enough. Aaron knew that what he had uncovered was valuable. This wasn't just the mindless scribbles of a teenager trying to get by. This was a weapon that had been hidden in plain sight all along. But with the revelation came a new reality. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He wasn't just someone to be overlooked or ignored. He had information that could change the course of the war, and the danger of that information was as sharp as the blade of a knife. Aaron had no illusions about his future. He was still poor, still a Jew in Nazi-occupied Warsaw, still someone who would be killed without a second thought if the wrong people discovered him. But for the first time, he realized that the world had made a grave mistake in underestimating him. In the silence of his hidden corner of the city, as the cold winds howled outside, Aaron began to understand something crucial. In a world full of blind obedience, the most dangerous weapon was a mind that could see through the fog. And now, with the code in his hands, he had the chance to do something no one had ever thought possible. The Nazis had underestimated him. They hadn't seen the sharpness of his mind, and they would soon learn to regret it. But first, he had to decide whether or not he was willing to risk everything for a chance to change history. Aaron looked down at the pieces of paper spread across the table, the codes deciphered, the messages that now formed a map of the enemy's weaknesses. The question wasn't whether he was smart enough to do it. The question was whether he had the courage to see it through. And in that moment, he knew the answer. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Aaron moved carefully through the streets, aware of every pair of eyes that passed him by, every whisper that fluttered in the air like the rustle of leaves. The war had settled into a rhythm, an oppressive, suffocating pattern that seemed to weigh on everything it touched. The German soldiers walked the streets as though they owned them, their boots heavy and certain, their eyes hard and cold. But for Aaron, the war had become something else entirely. It was a puzzle, something he was going to solve. By mid-March, the quiet whispers in the alleys and behind closed doors began to turn into something louder, something more tangible. Aaron wasn't alone in his observations. A handful of others had noticed the cracks in the German armor, the places where the seemingly invincible forces were vulnerable. But it was Aaron's mind that had picked up on the subtle nuances, the forgotten patterns. His understanding of the enemy's communications, of their predictable schedules, had given him something no one else had, an edge. It was in the small gatherings of resistance fighters, those who still had the will to fight, that Aaron found his purpose. He had never been a soldier, never trained to fight with a rifle or a pistol, but his weapon, the one he had discovered by sheer accident, was something far more dangerous: information. It wasn't long before he was meeting with the small resistance cells operating under the noses of the Nazis. At first, they had dismissed him, just another poor Jewish boy with dreams of doing something bigger than himself. But when Aaron began to pass along his findings, when he showed them the decryption notes, the cracks in the German machinery, they began to listen. One of the leaders, a man named Yitzhak, had initially doubted Aaron's abilities. Yitzhak had seen many so-called geniuses come and go, people who thought they could outsmart the enemy with nothing but their brains and a few tricks. But Aaron was different. His insights weren't theoretical. They were practical, grounded in the details of everyday life under occupation. Aaron had been listening to the radio broadcasts, watching the soldier patrols, and studying the German logistics. And with each new piece of information, the resistance began to change its strategy. It wasn't long before Aaron was sitting at the same table as the older, more seasoned fighters, his face lit by the dim glow of an oil lamp. Around him, the room was filled with tension. Maps covered the walls, lines drawn hastily, paths marked with chalk and charcoal. But none of that mattered to Aaron. He wasn't thinking about the logistics of the resistance or the plans for sabotage. His mind was somewhere else, piecing together the codes, finding the weak points. He wasn't just decoding messages. He was seeing the bigger picture. "Aaron," Yitzhak said one night, his voice low but urgent, "we've got to move fast. The Germans are planning something big. They're moving troops to the east. We need to know more." Aaron nodded, his hands moving over the notes, over the papers he had spent so many nights poring over. His fingers traced the familiar patterns, the cracks in the Germans' encryption. Each cipher, each line of text felt like a challenge, an enemy that he could defeat with the sheer force of his intellect. "I can do it," Aaron said softly, barely believing the words as they left his mouth. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time since the Nazis arrived, he felt a sense of control. He could take the chaos and make sense of it. He could turn the tide. The next few days were a blur of activity. Aaron worked tirelessly, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. The resistance was counting on him now, and every moment he wasted was a moment that the Nazis could use to destroy everything they had built. The codes were becoming clearer, but there was still much to decipher. It was a race against time, and Aaron could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, making it harder to breathe. There were nights when he barely slept, his eyes bloodshot and tired, but the work had to be done. He sat in the back rooms of safe houses, the shadows creeping across the walls as he worked over his makeshift desk. The room smelled faintly of stale bread and sweat, the air heavy with a mixture of desperation and determination. But Aaron couldn't afford to think about anything but the task before him. He was the key now. Without him, the Resistance's plans would falter. Without him, everything would fall apart. As Aaron cracked each new code, his understanding deepened. The more he uncovered, the more he saw how fragile the Nazis' hold on the region was. The Germans weren't as invincible as they wanted the world to believe. They had their own weaknesses, their own fears. They relied on systems, communication networks, supply chains, strategic deployments that could be broken. And Aaron, with his uncanny ability to see those cracks, was the one who could do it. The first major success came when Aaron uncovered a series of supply routes the Germans were using to transport weapons and reinforcements to their front lines. It was a delicate operation, this sabotage, and it took days of careful planning. Aaron's knowledge was the difference between life and death. The resistance acted quickly, hitting the convoys before the Germans had a chance to respond. The operation was a success, and the resistance fighters couldn't believe the damage they had inflicted. But with each victory, the stakes grew higher. The Nazis began to take notice. The operations, though small, were beginning to add up, and the Germans were beginning to tighten their grip on the city. Soldiers were sent in greater numbers to patrol the streets. Raids became more frequent. The quiet corners of Warsaw, once safe for the resistance, were no longer safe at all. Aaron felt the pressure building. He had seen men and women disappear before, heard the whispers of those who had been taken in the night. He knew that if he was caught, the consequences would be immediate and deadly. But even with that knowledge hanging over him, Aaron didn't falter. He had come too far, and the world outside, the one they were fighting for, had never seemed more distant. He couldn't afford to stop now. The work he was doing, the codes he was cracking, were more than just a way to fight the Nazis. They were a way to survive. For the first time in his life, Aaron understood the power of knowledge, the power of seeing what no one else could, of understanding what others couldn't. His mind had become a weapon in itself. And as he sat there, under the glow of the oil lamp, he knew that there was no turning back. The resistance had learned to trust him, and with that trust came the weight of responsibility. They needed him. The war needed him. And perhaps, just perhaps, his mind could be the one thing that tipped the balance in their favor. But the price of victory, Aaron was beginning to understand, was far higher than he had ever imagined. The weeks that followed were a blur of action, desperation, and fleeting moments of triumph. The resistance, emboldened by Aaron's brilliant mind, struck again and again at the heart of the German machine. Convoys were disrupted, supply lines severed, and whispers of sabotage spread through the city. But with each success came an equal measure of danger. The Germans were relentless in their pursuit of the resistance. They could feel the shift, the subtle friction that had begun to disrupt their perfect system, and they were closing in. Aaron had always known the risks, had always understood that the moment he began to outsmart the Germans, his life would be marked. His mind, once a tool for survival, had become a weapon that the Nazis could never afford to overlook. The coded messages, the secret communications, the patterns of their military strategy, it was all too much of a threat. The higher-ups in the Nazi command could not ignore a young Jewish boy who had turned their own methods against them. But Aaron, despite the mounting danger, had something that the Germans could never grasp: a sense of purpose, a belief that his mind was a force capable of changing the course of the war. He had outwitted the most powerful military machine on Earth, and he could feel the weight of his knowledge pressing down on him, urging him to keep going, to keep uncovering, to keep defying the odds. However, the world around him was becoming increasingly hostile. The once hidden pockets of the resistance were now under constant surveillance. The German soldiers, sensing the threat, began to raid the city more often, looking for anyone who dared to defy them. The whispers of betrayal grew louder in the shadows. Aaron knew that his time was running out. It was during the height of the Warsaw Uprising that Aaron felt the full weight of his efforts. The city was on fire. Tanks rumbled through the streets, and the air was thick with smoke. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. The Germans had launched a full-scale counteroffensive to crush the rebellion, and the resistance fighters, many of whom Aaron had worked with, were being pushed back. But amidst the chaos, Aaron continued to work. He couldn't stop. Even as the world around him fell apart, he was hunched over his makeshift desk, deciphering codes, tracing military movements, and feeding the information to his comrades. But for all his efforts, Aaron knew that victory, if it ever came, would not belong to him. The heroes of the resistance, the ones who fought on the front lines, were the ones who would be remembered. His contributions, cracking codes, unraveling the German strategy, exposing weaknesses, were invisible, intangible. In the eyes of the world, he was just another nameless face in the shadows, just another boy trying to survive in a city torn apart by war. The resistance had succeeded in several key operations, thanks to Aaron's intelligence. Yet, every victory fell hollow. The Nazis were retaliating with an unforgiving brutality, and with every blow the resistance struck, it seemed that the city of Warsaw grew weaker. The Germans, with their overwhelming power, were slowly but surely squeezing the life out of the city. The momentary triumphs were just blips in the grand scope of the occupation. The war was far from over. And then, on a night like any other, the inevitable happened. The Germans launched a surprise raid on one of the safe houses where Aaron had been working. The resistance had no warning. The soldiers came in with guns raised, and before anyone could react, they were inside. Aaron, though not physically caught, could hear the commotion in the hallway. He had to run. There was no choice. Every escape route had been blocked. The resistance had been betrayed by someone, though no one knew who. But the risk was too great. Aaron gathered the few pieces of work he had managed to complete that night, stuffing them into his jacket. He couldn't afford to leave the information behind. It was too valuable. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He moved toward the back door, but before he could reach it, there was a loud bang. The door was kicked open, and soldiers flooded into the room. They had found him.